Welcome to today's session, where we're sharing findings from PETAA's National Teaching of Writing Survey 2025. I'm Megan Edwards, CEO of PETAA, and it's my absolute pleasure today to be speaking to you on this topic. This survey was conducted in response to increasing national attention on writing achievement in Australian schools, including concerns emerging through NAPLAN data and broader public discussion about writing instruction. Importantly, here at PETAA, we wanted to ensure that teachers' voices were centred in this conversation. As our report states, teacher perspectives are often missing from broader debates about writing instruction, despite teachers being the people doing this work every day in classrooms. Our survey gathered 459 responses from teachers across Australia and explored writing pedagogy, assessment, differentiation, mentor texts, professional learning and school-wide approaches to writing. Today I'll be focusing less on isolated statistics and more on the national story emerging from the data. Before we look at what teachers told us, it's worth pausing on why this survey matters. Writing achievement has been a growing concern. NAPLAN data, anecdotal reports from secondary schools and international comparisons all point to a need for renewed attention. AERO's 2023 publication on whole school approaches to writing reignited the conversation in education circles, but in all of this public discourse, one voice has been largely absent: the classroom teacher. We set out to change that. This is the first national survey of its kind focused specifically on the teaching of writing in Australian primary schools. 459 teachers responded, and what they told us is both affirming and challenging. As mentioned, we had 459 respondents from across Australia. These teachers represented every state and territory and every sector. They represented classroom teachers, literacy leaders, curriculum coordinators and school leaders. Experience profiles ranged from early career teachers to those with 30, 40 years and more in the profession. It is important to acknowledge the limitations of our survey and of self-selection. Those who responded are likely to have a strong interest in writing instruction and are more likely to be affiliated or have a membership with PETAA. This means the findings may skew towards more engaged and informed practitioners. But even so, the patterns that emerge are consistent and compelling, and they align with what we know from the broader research literature. Let me give you the 5 headline findings before we go deeper. First, classroom pedagogy is genuinely strong. Teachers know what good writing instruction looks like and they're doing it. Second, whole school coherence is uneven. What happens in one classroom is not always connected to what happens next door or in the year above or below. Third, writing has been displaced. In many schools and systems, the focus on reading reform has meant writing has been positioned as a future priority rather than a current one. Fourth, assessment is a major pressure point. Teachers value formative assessment, but feel constrained by summative demands that don't always capture what matters most in writing. And fifth, differentiation is essential, but increasingly difficult, particularly in upper primary, where gaps widen and scaffolding reduces. These 5 themes run through everything that follows in this presentation. One of the most affirming findings in this survey is the strength of classroom pedagogy. Teachers across all year levels and sectors described using practices that are well aligned with the research evidence: modelled writing, joint construction, guided writing, scaffolded support, and a deliberate gradual release of responsibility. What's particularly striking is that teachers demonstrated sophisticated pedagogical knowledge even when they didn't use formal framework terminology. They described the practice, the thinking aloud, the co-construction, the targeted small group work, without necessarily naming it as the teaching and learning cycle or using the gradual release of responsibility model. This is important. It tells us that professional expertise is strong. The challenge is not teacher capability, it is creating the shared language and coherent conditions that allow that expertise to be consistent and cumulative across a school. This was one of the most significant findings in the survey. Teachers consistently described a tension between what they understand about writing development and the increasing expectations for student independence in upper primary. The report found that explicit instructional practices remained valued across all year levels, but their frequency appears to reduce in years 3 to 6 as curriculum and assessment pressures increase. Teachers expressed concern that many students are expressed to write independently before foundational skills at sentence, paragraph and text level are secure. The report argues that this developmental mismatch disproportionately affects students requiring additional support and limits opportunities for sustained growth in writing quality. Rather than indicating a rejection of explicit teaching in upper primary, the data suggests teachers may feel increasingly constrained in sustaining it consistently. The survey also revealed that writing is happening well beyond the traditional English or literacy block. Teachers describe using writing regularly across science, history, geography, civics, maths and the arts as a tool for recording, reasoning and communicating learning. This is consistent with the research on writing to learn. Teachers also described a strong connection between reading and writing, using mentor texts not just as models of craft, but as springboards for student writing. And critically, talk was identified as a key precursor to writing. Oral rehearsal, discussion, collaborative dialogue, these were described as essential preparation, particularly for students who need more time to develop their ideas before committing them to the page. The implication for curriculum design is significant. If writing is a mode of learning across all subjects, then writing instruction cannot be siloed within English. It requires cross-curricular attention, shared language, and coordinated planning. One of the strongest findings from the survey was that teachers feel highly confident selecting and using mentor texts to support writing instruction. What's particularly interesting is that this selection process is far from random. Teachers are making deliberate decisions about the texts they use, choosing books and other texts that offer rich language, sophisticated vocabulary, strong structural features, and content that is appropriate for the age and developmental stage of their students. When we look at how mentor texts are being used, the most common purpose is to draw students' attention to craft and voice. Teachers are using texts to help students notice the choices authors make, the words they select, the way they structure sentences, the tone they create, and the unique voice they bring to their writing. This is really where we see the reading-writing connection in action. Teachers view mentor texts as one of the most natural and effective ways to bridge reading and writing, helping students move from noticing what authors do to trying those same techniques in their own work. I love the quote on this slide because it captures that idea perfectly. Mentor texts show students what's possible as writers. They make the often invisible work of writing visible, demonstrating the specific moves that authors make and giving students something concrete to experiment with themselves. The survey data reinforces this. Rich language and vocabulary was the most important selection criterion, identified by 90% of respondents. 86% said alignment with the text type or teaching purpose influenced their choices, while 75% prioritised age appropriateness. Trusted recommendations from colleagues, professional learning, or organisations such as PETAA were also highly influential at 71%. One finding worth reflecting on is the gap between the top criteria and diversity-related considerations. While rich language and vocabulary were selected by 90% of teachers, representation of diverse cultures and perspectives sat down closer towards the 50% mark. It doesn't diminish their importance, but it does raise an interesting question for us as a profession about how we balance linguistic quality, teaching purpose, and representation when selecting mentor texts. Assessment emerged as one of the most challenging and contested areas in the survey. Teachers are clear about what they value: formative assessment, the observation, the conference, the targeted feedback that helps them understand where a student is as a writer and what they need next. But they reported that summative assessment demands frequently interrupt this work. Moderation cycles, reporting requirements, and accountability measures pull teachers towards assessment practices that are easier to standardise, but that don't always capture what matters most in writing. The concern about rubrics is particularly significant. Many teachers felt that existing rubrics, including those used in NAPLAN and school-based assessment, privilege surface features, spelling, punctuation, grammar. These are, of course, important, but they are not the whole story of writing quality. Cohesion, voice, authorial control, compositional craft, these are harder to assess, but arguably more important for developing writers. So this begs the question from systems and school leaders, how do we design assessment frameworks that honour the full complexity of writing development? Differentiation was one of the most consistently raised themes across the survey. Teachers described extensive use of scaffolded instruction, flexible grouping and targeted supports to meet the diverse needs of their students. For EALD learners, this included visual supports, oral rehearsal and structured language frames. For neurodiverse learners, it included transcription support, planning scaffolds and flexible task design. But sustaining this level of differentiation is demanding, and it becomes harder as students move through the primary years. In upper primary, the gap between the most and least proficient writers widens, and the expectation of independence increases. Teachers described a growing tension between what they know individual students need and what the curriculum and timetable allow them to provide. High ability writers were also identified as underserved, often given more writing rather than more challenging or more complex writing experiences. This is an equity issue as much as a pedagogical one. The second major finding of this survey was the gap between classroom expertise and whole school coherence. Individual teachers are doing impressive work, but that work is often happening in isolation, not connected to a shared school-wide approach, not supported by common language or frameworks, and not embedded in collaborative professional practice. The survey found that moderation is relatively common. Schools absolutely do come together to discuss student writing samples, typically aligned to reporting cycles. But fewer schools have established structures for collaborative planning, observation, or discussion of teaching practice. Teachers discuss student work together more often than they examine and refine their own teaching together. And the quote on this slide captures something important. Teachers are not asking for more autonomy. They're asking for clearer shared direction. They have the knowledge. They want the framework. Professional learning, unsurprisingly, emerged as one of the most powerful levers for improving writing instruction. The survey found a clear pattern where teachers reported sustained collaborative professional learning focused specifically on writing. They were more likely to describe clarity of approach, shared expectations, and greater confidence in their planning and instruction. The contrast with sporadic or minimal professional learning was stark. More variable practice, more reliance on individual initiative, less coherence across the school. The message is clear. One-off workshops are not enough. Writing requires ongoing, embedded, collaborative professional learning, the kind that builds shared language, shared frameworks, and a shared understanding of what good writing instruction looks like at every year level. And school leadership is critical. Where leaders prioritise writing as a sustained focus, not just a term-by-term initiative, professional learning is more coherent and practice is more consistent. This has direct implications for how systems design and fund professional learning. So, what do all these findings mean at a national level? Let me synthesise 5 key implications. First, curriculum design. Writing progression needs to be explicit, cumulative and coherent. The Australian curriculum, Victorian curriculum, New South Wales syllabus, they all have a role to play in articulating clear developmental expectations for writing at each year level. Not just text types and language features, but the full arc of writing development. Second, writing progression. We need a shared national understanding of how writing develops, from the foundational skills of transcription through to the compositional complexity of extended texts. Third, assessment. Our assessment frameworks need to evolve. They need to capture the full complexity of writing, not just the surface features that are easiest to standardise. Fourth, professional learning. This should not be left to individual schools or individual teachers to have to identify and fund. Systems need to invest in sustained writing-focused professional learning pathways. And fifth, system coherence. This survey confirms that writing is a national challenge. Variation is driven by school context, leadership, teacher knowledge, not by state curriculum differences. That means response needs to be coordinated at a national level. I want to leave you with 5 questions, not as rhetorical points, but as genuine invitations to reflect on what this survey means for your work. The first is about maintaining explicit instruction across all year levels, not just in the early years. The second is about the developmental tension we've discussed. How do we design our school curriculum to support a genuine, developmentally appropriate progression towards independence? The third is about shared language and frameworks. What would it take to give our teachers the coherent, school-wide framework they're asking for? The fourth is about assessment. How do we design systems that capture the full complexity of writing growth? And the fifth is perhaps the most urgent. How do we ensure that writing is not left behind as reading reform continues? I want to close with what I think is the most important message from this survey. Teachers are deeply committed, professionally knowledgeable, and actively working to improve their practice. The challenge is not teacher willingness or pedagogical capability. The challenge is systemic. It is the absence of coherent conditions, shared frameworks, shared language, sustained professional learning, and strategic attention to writing at every level of the system. Teachers have spoken. They've told us what they know, what they do, what they need, and what they're worried about. The question now is whether the system, curriculum designers, assessment authorities, system leaders, policy makers, will listen and respond. Writing is foundational. It is how students learn, how they communicate, how they participate in the world. It deserves our sustained, coordinated, evidence-informed attention. Thank you.